Well, those were the headlines, ladies and gentlemen, but let's move on to our top story tonight. Well, the China and the United States are clashing again over tariffs. We've seen Black Friday, Panic Monday, wiping out billions of investor wealth. And even though markets have recouped some of the losses seen yesterday, caution still persists. But despite seeing that violent volatility, US President Donald Trump remains unfazed by the havoc which his tariffs have brought about. He's called his retaliatory tariffs a much-needed medicine. It's quite unclear what exactly is Trump so eager to fix, but to many around the world, his medicine seems like a bitter pill to swallow. So China gave US a taste of its own medicine by slapping a 34% duty on US imports. Another retaliation came from the United States after that, and Donald Trump said that an additional 50% duty will be slapped if Beijing doesn't withdraw the 34% tariffs it imposed by Tuesday. China then retaliated that it will never accept the quote-unquote blackmail nature of the United States and fight till the very end. In fact, now the latest we're getting on this story is that in his latest post on Truth Social, Donald Trump has reiterated its stance on tariffs in China. He says, and I quote, "We are likewise dealing with many other countries, all of whom want to make a deal with the United States." And he also mentions China in that. But the bigger question is, can China fight back against Trump's unilateral bullying? At least that's what it calls. And what can China now offer to the United States? Well, we'll be asking those and many other questions related to the big story we're tracking right here on India Tonight. And joining us to discuss that big debate is a stellar lineup of guests. Well, Anil Trigunayat, former ambassador of Jordan and Libya and Malta, is joining us. Vivek Mishra, Deputy Director, Strategic Studies Program, ORF, is joining us. And also joining us is Betsy Stevenson, Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the Ford School, University of Michigan. Thank you very much, Ms. Stevenson and gentlemen, for joining us this evening on ET. Now, let me come to you first, Ms. Stevenson. Thank you very much for taking the time out and speaking with us. Now, this escalation between the United States and China follows what happened just a few days back when there was tariffs imposition. Then China hit back with retaliatory tariffs. However, back then the tariffs were more sector specific. But now it seems like a blanket imposition. But the big question now is, can China fight back Trump tariffs? And Donald Trump claims that China has agreed to have a deal with the United States. What do you expect China to do here? And can China stay firm?
I think President Trump is actually quite difficult to negotiate with because these tariffs aren't coming from a place of sort of reasoned, thought out, sort of systematically imposed tariffs where it's clear what he's asking. And I think that's one of the reasons markets have reacted so strongly. When he first put the tariffs on, he said he wasn't even open to negotiation, that he was going to change U.S. trade forever, and that he wasn't going to negotiate. This wasn't a negotiating ploy. Now he's pivoting to saying this is about negotiation, but no one still really understands exactly what he wants. The U.S. is, that the biggest economy in the world, and that's where Trump thinks his power is coming from. But China's the second biggest, and I think if anyone is going to stand up and push back, it is going to be China. I think it's important for China and for countries around the globe to realize that President Trump is a man who does not ever admit he's wrong, and they are going to need to find a way to make him declare himself a winner, even if they don't end up giving up very much. So you can see Trump is already starting to say China will come. China's going to be asking for a deal. It's going to be a great deal for the American people. I think the question is going to be, how do we get Trump a face-saving deal when it's clear that China's not going to back down and allow these giant across-the-board tariffs and do nothing in return? If you go back to the Trump first term, remember, he put tariffs on China, and China did hit back. Trump ended up spending a lot of the revenue he took in from the tariffs from China to pay off American exporters who lost because of the retaliatory tariffs from China. So I think he understands that that's on the cards right now, and there's a lot of American businesses that care a lot about their ability to sell to China.
Uh, right, Ms. Stevenson, and let me take that point across to Ambassador Trigunayat. Ambassador Trigunayat, the essential idea that Ms. Stevenson is saying that this is going to be, we'll have to see whether this turns out to be a face-saving deal for the United States or not. So what's on the table from the United States side, and what does China have to offer when Donald Trump says that at least 50 countries have approached the United States for a deal, and that includes China?
Well, as you know, that the tariffs are actually a double-edged weapon. And as has been mentioned by Mr. Stevenson, that it appears that although Trump loves tariffs as its toolkit, obviously it has not been very well thought out. I have gone through the White House fact sheet. They have tried to brush aside, and it is also true that Trump uses the tool coming from a maximalist position for eventually negotiating because he thinks himself to be a greatest deal maker. And in this case, possibly the only country that has really stood out to him as the second largest economy, which is China. Because for China, it is not only the tariffs or retaliating against the imposed tariffs by the United States, it also has the trade surplus with 150 countries in the world. It is the largest trading partner for the world compared to the United States in that sense. And therefore, what it has done is already, I mean, some very important decisions that China has made. Recently, there was reports that China has tried to integrate with its digital renminbi, a new alternate payment system or network, as it is called, already with the 10 ASEAN countries and about 6 Middle Eastern countries, carrying it forward to about 200 countries, and Russia and others are already part of that. Now, in that sense, 38% of the trade gets diversified from the dollar system. So you are looking really a part of de-dollarization happening, which President Trump wanted to prevent. Apart from crashing the markets, a bloodbath that has taken place, which has also hurt his own cabinet colleagues a great deal. For example, Elon Musk, he lost about 70, $80 billion already, and about $5 trillion were washed out of the Wall Street. Now, in that kind of a situation, there is a tremendous pressure within the United States as well. Trump, for the moment, may not feel that it is absolutely necessary, but I think we might be seeing some kind of a reprieve or a pause in next 90 days. As far as China is concerned, China has said that if this is how they are going to deal with it, we are ready for the fight till the end. So China is prepared. They will be suffering a great deal, no doubt. It's not that, as I said, it hits both sides. So we are going to see that there will be a global disruption once again, but then there will be a greater polarization, which we are going to witness. And I think that China is prepared for the worst at the moment, but they are also hoping for some kind of a deal. Now, that deal with main thing is that Trump wants that $293 billion trade deficit they have with the United States, between China and the United States, that should be wiped out. I mean, that's what he wants to do to have a balanced trade. I believe that the Chinese are willing to buy more oil and more gas from the United States to offset that to some extent, because they are the largest consumers of oil and gas. So I think that is one area. Then they will find out
Right.
many other areas. China has also stopped export of some rare earths, about 7 or 8 of them, completely banned. So we are going to see
Right.
it down
Right.
to hit the bottom if this is the trend that continues.
Correct. Absolutely. And Ambassador Trigunayat, when you mentioned about the trade deficit, and of course, Donald Trump desperately wants that trade deficit to reduce, but you can't reduce it in a matter of just a few days by way of tariffs, is what economists have been speaking about over these past few days. But Mr. Mishra, can Trump afford to play hardball like this with not just China, but other countries as well? And speaking about China specifically, China needs the United States, but it is the United States as well that needs China in sectors like critical tech, rare earths, like Ambassador Trigunayat was mentioning, and of course, defense.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an entangled economy. If you look at China and the United States today, it's deeply tied to each other, given the net worth that the two economies have. But I think there is a nuance there. One of which is certainly, if you talk about, there are two strategies according to which, by which China can really counter. One is, of course, the import, controlling some of the import, and the second is devaluing the yuan. I think both are fraught with risk for China. And I think the essential point here, where China risks being singled out if this contestation really goes on. And there is a deadline on April 9th that if China doesn't stand down, there's going to be additional tariff. So in this cycle of retaliatory tariffs, I think what's important is that the China plus one countries will be critical. I mean, we are already hearing that Vietnam has, talked with Donald Trump, other countries have reached out to him. If there is a deal on the specific specific important countries of the China plus one string, then I think it's going to be very critical for China to really stand by alone in that mix. So I think that is very important. The second is, can the United States do it? But particularly in relation to the critical minerals, if you look at the market value of critical minerals, they have consistently come down over the past 3 months. And that's why you see a scramble in the United States for Greenland, for Alaska, and other places, for Ukraine in a mineral deal. So I think they're looking at that potential and preparing or trying to prepare for an eventuality where you don't have critical mineral reliance on China of the kind that the United States today has because of a trade war.
Right, Mr. Mishra, let me come to you, Ms. Stevenson. Now, very important points being made with respect to de-dollarization, with respect to China plus one, and we'll address some of those points a little later. But let me ask you, what do you anticipate China to do in the next few days? Because if you see China's response, it has been talking of a deal. It has been talking of coming on the negotiating table with respect to these tariffs. But in the same breath, it's also been slapping tariffs on the United States. So what's really happening there? Put that into context, put China's response into context for us. And does China stand to lose or gain if this deal making is prolonged?
I think the whole globe stands to lose if this deal making is prolonged. And it's not just China that will be hurt, it's the United States. I think, again, why are the markets down so much around the globe? Because the actions that President Trump has taken, it threatens to shrink economic growth around the globe. That means hurting China, that means hurting the United States. I do think that China risks being, the only country left with tariffs if they push back too hard. But at the same time, China really does have a lot of bargaining power. You just heard they have critical minerals that the United States depends on. I don't think trying to invade Greenland is going to solve that problem for the United States. They also are a market that a lot of American businesses rely on. So I think their negotiating strength comes from the fact that American businesses want to be able to sell and export to China, that American businesses need inputs from China, and that, if President Trump says they didn't bring anything to the table, I'm done with them, it's 100% tariffs, I think it is cutting off his own nose to spite his face. Like the harm to the United States will be just as great as the harm to China. The problem, if you're a small country like Vietnam, is the U.S. could get on without trade to Vietnam. There's a lot of things we rely on there. A lot of people moved out of China. A lot of companies moved their manufacturing out of China into Vietnam, into Bangladesh. They wanted to diversify because they knew the tensions between these two big economies would mean that there could be trade wars. And so we've seen that kind of diversification. It didn't help anybody when Trump announced these tariffs, because the tariffs were just as bad almost on countries like Bangladesh, countries like Vietnam. And so, I think that, China is in the best position to fight back because the United States needs them pretty much as they need the United States. I think the fundamental thing that President Trump has forgotten is that, the United States might be, a quarter of the world's GDP, but if the 75% of the world's GDP band together, start to trade with each other, start to move away from the US dollar, this is going to cause a lot of problems in the US. It's going to lead the US to have a much weaker position going forward.
Right. Let me ask you one more question before I go to my other panelists. Since you mentioned about, de-dollarization and the move away from dollar, how soon is that going to be a possibility? Because before the election of Donald Trump as president, once again, analysts were debating and they were saying that de-dollarization is not going to happen in the immediate near term. But now you have also mentioned it. Another panelist has also mentioned it. What do you think will bring about de-dollarization?
I don't think it's a thing that happens overnight. I think the issue is, the United States has for a very long time had a reputation for having the most stable currency, the most stable monetary policy, and the government debt, U.S. Treasuries that were the most likely to pay you back, so the safest. And the US has really benefited from that. We pay less on our debt than other countries because of the fact that we are considered the risk-free asset. I think that Donald Trump has risked that. And I think that is going to end up driving up interest rates in the United States. And I think countries are going to end up moving away from the US dollar slowly. If Donald Trump wakes up one morning like he did with tariffs and decides that he's going to fire the head of the Federal Reserve Board, I think you're going to see de-dollarization happen a whole lot more rapidly. And maybe that's the one reason he hasn't touched that agency yet. So how quickly it happens, every day we're going to be taking a look at what's happening and how much can you rely on US dollars. But I think there's a lot of people around the globe that are realizing that they need to diversify away from US dollars.
Right. Right, absolutely, very well put, Ms. Stevenson, on that point about de-dollarization, that Trump himself is furthering that very cause that he protested so much against. But let me come to you, Ambassador Trigunayat. Let's speak about India's standpoint. Does India stand to gain amidst all of this? And how do you really anticipate India and other geographies in our neighborhood to fill this gap that's been left by these economic tensions that are brewing between the China and the United States? I'm asking both in terms of supply chain shifts and being able to negotiate with the United States when it comes to these tariffs.
Well, in the first place, all these global value supply chains, which after a great stress, were just about coming out of it, which happened in pandemic, then due to the wars, and now once again we have these tariff wars, which is an extreme point that we are seeing that. But at the same time, let me also talk about a little bit about Vietnam. Vietnam has offered a 0% duty. 70 other countries have also approached, like us. India has also approached the US that we are going to negotiate. We are also saying that we'll probably have a free trade agreement with them sooner than we expect. But in the meantime, it is going to impact us. Greatly, because United States happens to be our largest trading partner. For President Trump, as I say always, that for him, friends, enemies, and frenemies are all looked at the same lens. So he imposes these on everyone. He's not sparing. Today we saw that Netanyahu was there talking and pleading about the 0% tariffs and trade, because the largest trading partner again is the US for them. But for China, the US is not the largest trading partner, even though they have a very big trade deficit in their favor. But at the same time, we have more issues. I mean, we are exporting more of our services, so we'll have to continue to see that the services remain intact. So I think those negotiations will come from that perspective. Now, China, the United States economy has been ballooned a lot. This is the most indebted country in the world, with $36 trillion in debt, at a $31 trillion GDP, for example. Now, their trade deficit is roughly about 1.2 trillion or something, and then 1.6 trillion in debt servicing that is coming up now. So their situation is really bad. Inflation is there, and with the kind of these wars and the impact of these tariffs is also going to increase a much more, I would say, as Mrs. Stevens said, the problems for the Americans themselves in the first place, and the rest of the world in any case is going to suffer from these. So these are going to be sort of a mutually destructive syndrome with which the United States and the Chinese are suffering at the moment, between the two largest economies. So as far as India is concerned, Many people say that we could perhaps gain if the China is slapped with the higher rates of duty. But if you go by the cycle, I mean, you are also importing from China a great deal. It's our second largest trading partner. As far as Vietnam is concerned, this China plus one strategy is also driven by China. Because seeing which way the Americans were going, they started investing a great deal, exporting a lot of things to Vietnam. From Vietnam, it is going to the United States and from other countries in the ASEAN and elsewhere. And so China, in that case, was basically disseminating its risk across geographies. So that is how it is working out. So it is not something the Chinese have been playing a smart game, but of course, this kind of a disruption tends to disrupt the whole value supply chain in unprecedented ways.
Right, Ambassador. And Mr. Mishra, would you agree with what Ambassador Trigunayat has stated, that this whole China plus one angle was orchestrated by China itself, and now it is it is winning. It is at a winning end so far as that strategy is concerned. And how does India then get impacted? Because if Vietnam is offering zero tariffs, then of course India has some stiff competition coming in from Vietnam already as far as manufacturing is concerned, because India has fewer zero tariff lines than Vietnam.
So broadly, if you look at the China plus one strategy, it works. It's a double-edged sword. I mean, it works for the United States. It works for China in certain ways. So I don't think there is one way to look at it. But broadly, yes, I agree in the fact that it worked for China. It continues to work for China. And therefore, now it is easier for the United States to target certain specific points. For example, if you look at the Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan, etc., major junctions of the Belt and Road Initiative, they have been targeted. And I think the end game of the United States in this retaliatory cycle seems to be a singling out of China, which remains to be seen if they will be able to sort of to achieve. On India, I think, as far as the muted response of India on some of these issues, I think we are our relative distance between a partner and a friend and an ally gives us certain resident advantages vis-a-vis the United States. And I think that continued to play out when we saw the global financial crisis in 2008. And that certainly proves somewhat cautionary right now. But the major thing about India is that we are sitting on a 46 billion trade surplus with the United States. And the fact that we are in the process of negotiating a bilateral trade agreement, a BTA, which has a deadline of fall 2025, I think that augurs well for the negotiations in some ways, because India has already outlined certain red lines that it will not compensate with, which is not compromise with. Some of which are agriculture and pharma. Pharma has been left out by the United States. I see signaling from both the United States and India towards that the intention to meet halfway. So I'm a little positive, a little more than positive about India-US trade negotiations as it's playing out. Not to say that India will be completely left out. We will feel the impact in very many ways. But I think until the negotiations go on, and we are not unlike the first Trump administration, the fact that we are not in a retaliatory mode to begin with. I'm sure the retaliations, if needed, could come from India and will come from India. But I think the first intent is not to put retaliation on the United States is a good sign for the bilateral trade negotiations, because some of these works are still in the process. So I think that's a good approach, but we'll see where this goes.
Absolutely, Mr. Mishra, and that's what government sources have indicated to ET now, that India's approach is not going to be that of global retaliation against the Donald Trump administration on the tariffs front, but it is going to be around around dialogue and how to arrive at that mutually beneficial bilateral trade agreement. In fact, that also reverberated in the message of United States official who had a phone call with India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. J. Shankar, that both sides are looking at making that deal at an earliest possible time. But let me come back to you, Ms. Stevenson. Now, Mr. Mishra is stating that Trump's endgame is the singling out of China. Now, if I were to quote what Ray Dalio in his latest message on X has stated, he talks about this overall situation as it's panning out, and he calls it a decline of the United States and the rise of China, and that it is a once-in-a-lifetime breakdown of the global monetary, political, and geopolitical orders. Would you agree with that? And if yes, then what is the new global order that's coming up?
I would agree that we are definitely in a moment where the global order has been fractured. I don't think anybody actually really knows where it's going and what's going to happen next, partially because it's kind of hard to predict what President Trump is going to do. I don't think that this across-the-board tariffs, the way he's been attacking Canada and Mexico and Europe, has been just some strategy to be able to go after China at the end. I think if he wanted to go after China, he would have gone after China. I think that President Trump actually believes, I think wrongly, but I think he literally believes that a bilateral trade deficit is somehow bad, that every country should buy as much from us as we buy from them, and that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? We buy, there are some very small countries where we buy something they have, like vanilla from Madagascar. And it doesn't really matter that people in Madagascar don't end up wanting to buy that much from the United States. What should matter is global trade. Now, there's a question about whether President Trump really wants to have overall balance around the globe so that the United States is exporting as much as it's importing. And, honestly, that has more to do with, the demand for being able to invest in the United States. And so he seems misguided in not understanding that he could get trade balance if he wanted, but that's also going to have to involve, Americans either investing as much in foreign assets or foreigners investing less in the United States. I think the good news for him is he has achieved scaring people away from investing in the United States, which will, as we already discussed, decrease demand for dollars. And that will make it easier, as the value of the dollar goes down, should make it easier for us to export. But I really think he just does not understand trade. He thinks of himself as this great deal maker. He claims that when Americans are paying low prices for things, we're getting a bad deal. I think we're getting a good deal when we pay low prices for things. When you ask what's the new global order, I think I'm just going to remind the rest of the globe that when you're 75% of the world's economy, you actually have a lot of power if you band together. And I think we're going to see more agreement. I think we're going to see a stronger Europe. I think we're going to see a stronger China. And I hope for your sake, we see a stronger India.
Well, that's very interesting to know, Ms. Stevenson. But at this point, I'd request all our guests to stay on as we're getting some breaking inputs. Well, India's Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal is speaking in Mumbai at an event. He addresses the issue of trade talks. He says that trade talks with many countries are going on smoothly. He says, and I quote, "All is well." He says that India is working on a bilateral trade deal with the United States. India-US trade deal will cover a wide array of products. Series of engagements with United States have happened, and these are going well. He also says that the government can assure Indian businesses that countries' interests are at the forefront of all the decisions that the Indian government will take, and our trade deal with the United States will power the economy towards Viksit Bharat. Those are some of the comments that India's Commerce and Trade Minister that are coming in from Minister Piyush Goyal. He's speaking at an event in Mumbai. He's addressing addressing the very important issue of tariffs. And where does that leave Indian businesses, given that there's been a lot of anxiety, a lot of uncertainty on what's going to happen next? India has been slapped with 26% of tariffs. And of course, negotiations with the United States are going on. The Indian government calls these negotiations as mutually beneficial talks, these negotiations that are going on with the United States. In fact, we are also given to understand from government sources that no subject is off the table with respect to BTA negotiations. And ET now was told by government sources 3 days back that government will take all steps, direct, indirect measures and all measures within a legal framework to stop dumping of excess capacity of exports from other countries, given that that also has been a concern so far as these tariffs are concerned. In fact, pharma is a sector that the Indian government will protect. Agriculture, dairy are the other two sectors that the government will protect. Let me take you through once again the comments of Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal. He states that trade talks with many countries are going on smoothly. Remember, that's been India's trade policy, to have many FTAs going on with multiple countries. In fact, 7 countries are currently engaged with India so far as free trade agreements are concerned. He also says that a series of engagements with the United States is going well. He has assured Indian businesses that countries' interests will be kept at forefront of all of these decisions. He says that our trade deal with the United States will power the economy towards a Viksit Bharat. Ambassador Trigunayat, let me come to you. Those are some of the comments that Commerce and Industry Minister Piyush Goyal has made. He is speaking at an event in Mumbai. But let me ask you, when Ms. Stevenson talks about the New World Order and she says that India has a very important place so far as this emerging New World Order is concerned, how do you see that? Where does it leave India? And what role do you see India playing in this New World Order?
Well, at the moment, no one knows where this current totally dysfunctional world order is going. We have seen that the multilateral institutions have been undermined, mainly by the United States and the West. We also see that China is trying to come up with its own model and has come up with something like the GDI, GCI, GSI, and BRI and all that. So in that sense, India, which is looking to become a certain kind of follows a strategic autonomy, follows the multi-alignment principle, have good relations with everyone, tries to have a sane foreign policy driven by, as you know, this world is one family, Vasudhaiva one Kutumbakam. So what I'm looking at is today, as and when the world stabilizes. Personally, I feel that we are heading towards a Cold War 2.0 kind of scenario eventually. But there would definitely be several economic poles, and India would be one geoeconomically. And as far as geopolitically it is concerned, I think India will be the leading the global south, or be the voice of the global south, which is about 125 to 130 countries who look up to India. More and more countries in the world today are looking to exercise their strategic autonomy. And they are all going to bandwagon with this, despite the fact that we'll have these two major powers fighting each other in whichever way they do so. But that's a bit difficult to predict today. The situation is extremely bad at the moment, which has been worsened by this tariff war.
Right, Ambassador, let me come to you, Mr. Mishra. Even as we speak, China has launched a formal complaint with the WTO and it has accused the United States of violating trade rules. This is a charge that India's Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal has leveled against China as well. He's alleged China of unfair trade practices and lack of transparency ever since it joined WTO in 2001. So do you think that it is rather hypocritical of China when it makes those claims at the WTO, given that it grew at the cost of other economies, as has been claimed by Minister Goyal?
So it's certainly a fact that China has grown to what it has become an economic behemoth at the on the back of the policies by the West, which is largely a liberal economic world order. That's certainly true. But in terms of the other, in terms of the fact that China went to the WTO, it's quite unexpected lines, because China has been saying that it will do so. But the irony here really is that the 2017 USTR investigation, the United States Trade Representative investigation, found, which was under Trump 1 administration, and the trade war, when for the first time escalated under Trump 1, the primary basis of that escalation was that China was involved in some kind of currency manipulation as well as trade manipulation. So I think this is just, as I said, a retaliatory cycle. This was pretty much expected, and China going to WTO will have many countries tell a different story about what China wants to do. But as I said, this is pretty much on the expected line, and the US will counter this narrative by saying that we've already, our 2017 investigation actually lays out how China actually has manipulated currency. If you look at the other smaller countries, which are included in the list of 60 countries that Trump has tariffed in the retaliatory tariffs, you will see that a slew of countries have been put there just because of currency manipulation. And therefore, for example, Mexico, as Trump has said, that Mexico has been at the heart of the fact that Mexico is being laid as a country that violated NAFTA, and that's became a reason why Trump tore NAFTA and agreed and started negotiating the MCA, was the fact that it became a ground for the United States to actually bring for China to facilitate goods into the United States without paying the tariff that it usually pays when it comes from China. So I think it became a via media in many ways, and to avoid that circumvention, I think all of this is playing out, and therefore you see that there is a clear link between what US intends to do with China, its largest trading partner, and that can't be dissociated from its other actions elsewhere in the world.
Absolutely, and we do hope and do see that might be reverberating with other other trading partners of China. On that note, thank you very much, Ms. Stevenson, for joining us on ET Now. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks very much, Mr. Mishra and Ambassador Trigunayat as well, for joining us here on ET Now and sharing your perspectives on this big story that we're tracking here on ET Now.